A loud crack echoed across the parking lot. For a second, the world seemed to freeze. Every worker at the luxury car wash turned their heads toward the unbelievable scene. A rich, elegantly dressed white woman standing with her hands still raised in the air, her palm red from the slap she had just delivered. The victim? A young black boy, no older than 19, wearing a worn-out uniform stained with soap and grease. He held his cheek, his face burning, not just from the pain, but from the humiliation. The woman's furious voice sliced through the silence. "How dare you touch my car with your filthy hands? Do you even know how much this costs? You should be grateful I let you near it." Her diamond rings sparkled under the sunlight as she glared at him, disgust written all over her face. But she had no idea who she had just slapped, because the boy she had humiliated was the son of the man who owned everything she thought she ruled. Billionaire's wife slaps a car wash boy, then discovers his father owns everything. And in just a few moments, her entire world was about to come crashing down. Earlier that day, the afternoon sun blazed over Platinum Hand Car Wash, a high-end service center where only the richest of the rich brought their luxury vehicles. Michael Carter Jr., a tall, slim 19-year-old, wiped the sweat off his forehead as he scrubbed down the wheels of a sleek, jet-black Rolls-Royce. He wasn't just any worker. He didn't have to work here. He was the son of Michael Carter Sr., the billionaire real estate mogul who owned not only this car wash but half the city. But Michael Jr. had never been one to take the easy road. His father had raised him to earn his way, to understand how hard-working people lived. So here he was cleaning cars, dealing with rude customers, learning discipline. And then she arrived. Veronica Whitmore Blackwood, a socialite, a woman of wealth, and the wife of Richard Blackwood, a man who thought he was the king of the business world. Her entrance was like a storm. A white Bentley Bentayga rolled into the car wash, and before it had even come to a complete stop, she swung open the door and stepped out in sky-high heels, her designer sunglasses reflecting the sun. The moment she saw Michael Jr., she sneered. She didn't like the way he looked. She didn't care that he was working hard. All she saw was a young black man near her expensive car. Michael, not knowing who she was, smiled politely. "Good afternoon, ma'am. How would you like your car cleaned today?" Veronica barely glanced at him as she pulled off her glasses. "Just do your job. And be careful. This car is worth more than your entire life." Michael ignored the insult. He was used to people like her. He nodded, picked up his cleaning cloth, and started working on her car. Everything was fine, until it wasn't. Michael was wiping the side mirror, making sure there wasn't a single streak left, when suddenly, Veronica shrieked, "Stop! Stop! What are you doing?" Michael jumped back, confused. "Ma'am?" Veronica stormed toward him, eyes filled with pure rage. "Did you just touch my car with your hands? Your dirty hands." Michael looked down at his gloved hands. "Ma'am, I'm wearing protective gloves, and I was just..." Slap. The sound was like a whip cutting through the air. Michael stumbled back, his cheeks stinging, his mind racing to process what had just happened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Not because he wanted to hit her, but because he had never been disrespected like this in his life. The entire car wash fell silent. Workers and customers stared, some pulling out their phones to record. Veronica pointed a shaking, perfectly manicured finger at him. "You are nothing. Nothing but a lowlife washing cars. People like you should learn their place. This is why your kind will never have anything." Michael's vision blurred with rage. He had dealt with racism before. He had been treated unfairly before. But this was something else. And just when he was about to walk away, a black limousine pulled into the car wash at full speed. The driver barely had time to park before a tall, powerful man in a sharp navy blue suit stepped out, his eyes scanning the crowd. Gasps filled the air as people recognized who he was. Michael Carter Sr., the owner of Platinum Hand Car Wash, and the billionaire who held more power in this city than Veronica's husband ever could. Veronica's face twisted in confusion. She had no idea why people suddenly looked so nervous. No idea who this man was. Until Michael Jr. turned toward him and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Dad." Veronica's entire body went stiff. Her eyes darted between the car wash boy she had just slapped and the billionaire standing in front of her. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She finally realized she had just attacked the son of the most powerful man in the city. Michael Carter Sr. stepped forward, his voice low and deadly. "What?" he said, eyes locked on Veronica. "Did you just do to my son?" Veronica's face drained of color. For the first time in her privileged, spoiled life, she felt true fear. Veronica's entire body froze. The weight of her mistake hit her like a speeding truck. This wasn't just some random car wash boy she had humiliated. This was Michael Carter Jr., and the man standing in front of her, the billionaire whose name carried more power than even her own husband's, was his father. Michael Carter Sr.'s eyes were locked on her, sharp as a blade. The kind of look that stripped a person down to nothing. The entire car wash had fallen into complete silence. Every worker, every customer, even the security guard standing near the Bentley. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Except for Michael Sr. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of weight that made even the richest men in the city think twice before speaking. "I asked you a question." Veronica's throat went dry. She tried to find her voice, but it came out weak, unsteady. I didn't know he was your son." Michael Sr. stepped closer, towering over her, his presence alone making her shrink back. His face remained unreadable. "Oh, so that's the problem?" he asked. "Not that you slapped an innocent young man, but that you slapped the wrong one." Veronica's hands started shaking. She could feel the eyes of every person in the car wash on her. Her privilege, her money, her connections, none of it could save her from what was happening right now. She had never been put in a situation like this, and for the first time in her life, she felt small. Victor Carter Jr. still hadn't said a word. His cheek was red and swollen, but his eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, were locked on her, studying her. Not with anger, with disappointment, as if he had expected nothing less from someone like her. That stung more than any words he could have said. Michael Sr. turned to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay, son?" Michael Jr. nodded, his voice even. "I'm fine, Dad." His father exhaled slowly, then turned back to Veronica. "I'm going to ask you again," he said. "What did you just do to my son?" Veronica's mind raced. She needed a way out of this, a way to twist the situation in her favor. But for once, there was none. And just when she thought things couldn't get any worse, a black SUV pulled up beside the limousine. And out stepped Richard Blackwood, her husband, her powerful, arrogant husband. Veronica sighed in relief as he approached. Maybe, just maybe, he could fix this. But when Richard laid eyes on Michael Sr., his entire face changed. Not in confidence, not in control, in fear. Veronica's stomach dropped. Michael Carter Sr. smirked, as if amused by the panic flashing through Richard's eyes. "Richard," he said smoothly, "nice of you to join us." Richard forced a tight smile. "Michael, I wasn't expecting to see you here." Michael Sr. chuckled. "Oh, I'm sure you weren't." He gestured to his son, still standing there with a handprint on his cheek. "It seems your wife decided to lay hands on my son today." Richard's entire body went rigid. His head snapped toward Veronica. "You did what?" Veronica opened her mouth, trying to explain, but Richard cut her off. His voice dropped dangerously low. "Are you insane?" Veronica froze. She had never heard him speak to her like that. Michael Sr. let the moment sink in. Then, with a smooth wave of his hand, his personal security stepped forward. All three of them. Each of them stood tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in sharp suits. The kind of men who didn't take orders from anyone except Michael Carter Sr. And that's when Veronica knew. This wasn't just a conversation. This was a warning. And Richard knew it too. Because even he, the self-proclaimed king of the business world, had never dared to cross Michael Carter Sr. And now his wife had. Richard swallowed hard and turned to Michael Sr. "Michael, I'm sure we can work this out," he said carefully. "Let's not make a scene over a misunderstanding." Michael Sr. let out a dry chuckle. "A misunderstanding?" He tilted his head, his voice dangerously low. "I wonder, Richard, if my son had slapped your wife instead, would you have called it a misunderstanding?" Richard had no answer. Because they both knew the truth. If Michael Jr. had so much as breathed wrong in Veronica's direction, Richard would have had lawyers, police, and media headlines within minutes. But now that the tables had turned, suddenly, he wanted to sweep it under the rug. Michael Sr. turned to his security team. "Take her inside." Veronica's heart stopped. "Double what?" she stammered. The security team stepped forward. Richard didn't move. He didn't try to stop them. He just watched, because even he knew there was nothing he could do. Veronica backed away, her hands shaking. "Richard," she called out. Richard just ran a stressed hand through his hair. "Do what he says." The words hit her like a brick. She had spent her life being untouchable. But now, she was being escorted away like a criminal. Her legs nearly gave out. Michael Jr. finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and filled with power. "You thought I was just a car wash boy," he said. "Now you're about to find out exactly who I am." Veronica's vision blurred. She wanted to scream, to argue, to fight back. But the moment she stepped inside that office, she knew her life would never be the same again. Veronica stumbled into the office, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This couldn't be happening. She was Veronica Whitmore Blackwood, a woman of wealth, status, and power. She wasn't someone who got dragged into offices like a disobedient child. But here she was, because she had slapped the wrong person. The room was large, sleek, and intimidating, designed for business, not mercy. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling glass, giving a perfect view of the luxury cars outside. A long, polished conference table sat in the center, and at the head of it, Michael Carter Sr. took a seat. Calm, unshaken, in complete control. Veronica's own husband, Richard, remained silent as he followed her inside, his face a mixture of stress and pure fear. Michael Jr. stood at his father's side, arms crossed. The red imprint of her hand was still on his cheek. Veronica felt small. She had spent her whole life looking down on people. But now, she was the one being judged. Michael Sr. gestured to a chair. "Sit." Veronica hesitated, but the two security guards behind her didn't. She quickly sank into the chair, her heart pounding. Michael Sr. leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. His voice was low but sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Let's get one thing straight," he said. "The only reason you're sitting here and not being dragged through a legal battle that will leave you with nothing is because I allow it." Veronica's stomach twisted. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain some control. "Michael, listen. I wasn't talking to you." Michael Sr. cut him off without even glancing in his direction. Richard shut up immediately. Veronica's hands clenched into fists under the table. "Why are we making such a big deal out of this?" She finally spoke, trying to sound confident, even though her voice betrayed her. "I didn't know who he was. It was just a slap." Michael Jr. let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Just a slap?" His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with something deeper, something that made her skin crawl. Michael Sr. shook his head slowly. "Tell me, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his gaze never leaving her, "if my son had slapped you across the face in front of your staff, in front of cameras, in front of the whole world, would you call it just a slap?" Veronica's lips parted, but she couldn't find an answer. Because they both knew the truth. If Michael Jr. had laid a single hand on her, the entire world would have stopped. Richard would have called every lawyer in the city to destroy him. The media would have run headline after headline, painting Michael as some dangerous, violent thug. And yet, when it was her who had done it, she wanted it to be brushed aside like it didn't matter. Veronica's silence spoke louder than any excuse she could have given. Michael Sr. smiled faintly. "That's what I thought." Veronica gritted her teeth. "I'll apologize," she blurted out, "to your son, publicly, if that's what you want." Michael Jr. arched an eyebrow. "You think this is about an apology?" His father leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "No," Michael Sr. said. "This isn't about an apology. This is about consequences." Veronica's blood ran cold. Richard finally stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Michael, let's talk about this. We've been in business together for years. I've respected you. I've worked with you. There's no reason for this to escalate." Michael Sr. raised a hand, cutting him off again. "You're right, Richard," he said smoothly. "We have worked together for years." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around to face them. Veronica's stomach dropped. It was a contract, a very specific contract. And at the top, in bold letters, it read, "Termination of partnership, Blackwood Industries." Veronica's lungs squeezed. Michael Sr. was ending his business with Richard. This wasn't just about embarrassing her. This was about destroying them. Richard's face drained of color. "Michael," he whispered, stepping forward like he could physically stop what was happening. "You can't do this." Michael Sr. remained unbothered. "Oh, but I can." He tapped the phone again, and a few seconds later, Richard's own phone buzzed. He yanked it out of his pocket, his eyes widening in horror as dozens of messages flooded his inbox. Calls, emails, people dropping their deals with him. Veronica snatched her own phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her notifications. Blackwood Industries stock plummeting. Breaking, Richard Blackwood's company facing massive fallout. Michael Carter Sr. severs all business ties with Blackwood Industries. It was already happening. Before they had even left the room, the world was already turning against them. Veronica's breath hitched. She had never felt powerless before. But now she understood. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to be crushed under someone else's power. Michael Sr. stood from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket. "Consider this," he said, "a lesson." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words crushed her. "Not just for you, Veronica." His gaze flickered to Richard, who looked like he was on the verge of collapsing. "But for your whole family." Veronica's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to say something, to beg, to plead. But what could she say? Nothing, because she had slapped the wrong boy. And now she was paying the price. Veronica sat frozen in her chair, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had lost. Her entire world was falling apart before her eyes. Michael Carter Sr. stood at the head of the room like a king watching his enemies crumble. His face was unreadable, but his power was absolute. Her husband, Richard, looked like a man on the verge of a heart attack. He was gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white, scrolling through message after message of disaster. Calls from partners withdrawing investments. Emails from executives distancing themselves. Headlines dragging his name through the mud. The entire Blackwood empire was unraveling because of her. Richard turned to her slowly, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before. "Hate." His jaw clenched. His voice was low, sharp, deadly. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Veronica flinched. "Richard, Shut up." It wasn't a yell. It wasn't a scream. But it was worse. It was cold. She had never heard him speak to her like that before. Michael Jr. watched the exchange, his face calm, almost amused. "You know," he said, his voice smooth, "if your wife hadn't acted like she owned the world, maybe you'd still have a piece of it." Veronica's fingernails dug into the table. Her chest tightened, and suddenly rage bubbled up. She had spent her whole life in control. She had spent years being worshipped, feared, respected. And now she was nothing. Her lips curled in anger. "This isn't fair." Michael Sr. raised an eyebrow. "Fair?" She shoved back her chair, standing up, her breathing heavy. "You are destroying my entire life over a slap." Michael Jr. scoffed. "It wasn't just a slap." Michael Sr. leaned forward. "No, Veronica, it wasn't. It was a reminder of who you are, of what you think you can get away with. You didn't just slap my son." His voice hardened. "You slapped the wrong man's son." Veronica's hands shook. Her gaze darted to Richard, hoping, begging for some kind of help. But he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Michael Sr., his face pale, his voice weak. "Michael," Richard started, "maybe we can fix this." Michael Sr. exhaled, checking his watch. "We can't. It's already done." Richard's face collapsed. Years of business, of building an empire, of being at the top of the world. All gone in minutes. Veronica felt sick. "This isn't happening," she whispered, shaking her head. Michael Sr. gave her a cold smile. "Oh, it is?" The door behind them opened, and more security entered. Michael Sr. nodded toward them. "Escort Mrs. Blackwood out." Veronica's blood ran cold. "What?" Michael Jr. leaned back against the table, crossing his arms. My father is generous, but even he has his limits. The security guards stepped closer. Richard still said nothing, because, deep down, he agreed. Veronica's chest tightened. Her own husband wasn't defending her. Not anymore. She had slapped the wrong boy, and now there was no one left to save her. Michael Sr. tilted his head. You can leave quietly, or you can make it worse for yourself. Your choice. Veronica's legs felt weak. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not to Veronica Whitmore Blackwood. But as the security moved in, her body betrayed her. She turned and ran. Not because she thought she could escape, but because she couldn't bear to see their faces as she was thrown out. The last thing she heard was Michael Sr.'s voice, smooth and final. Goodbye, Veronica. And just like that, her life was over. The Blackwood mansion was no longer hers. The cars, the clothes, the social status, all gone. The news had devoured her. She had been dragged through the mud, labeled a racist, a disgrace, a fallen queen. Richard had separated from her within days, quietly distancing himself. Because even he knew Veronica was a sinking ship, and he wasn't going to drown with her. She sat in a tiny, rented apartment, scrolling through her phone, looking at what used to be her life. And in the middle of all the chaos, a new headline appeared. Michael Carter Jr. named new CEO of Carter Enterprises. The boy she had slapped wasn't just the heir to an empire. He was now running it. Veronica's vision blurred with rage, with humiliation, with regret. She had lost, because in the end, power belongs to those who know how to keep it. And she had thrown hers away with a single slap.